There have been thousands of years of recorded history full of incredible stories. However, many of the most entertaining anecdotes may never have happened at all. Often, these stories first began circulating as fact well after the people involved were dead, meant as a way to emphasize a particular character trait of that individual. Others used entirely fictional people to illustrate a particular point that the speaker wanted to get across. Today we'll be diving into 50 apocryphal tales, looking at some of the most famous and memorable stories from throughout history that may or may not have actually transpired. George Washington the Cherry Tree. When George Washington was 6 years old, he was given a hatchet as a present by his father. As he was still a young child, Washington went out to play with his new toy, chopping at various things. While running around, Washington came across a cherry tree and struck it multiple times with his hatchet. He did not fully cut down the tree, but he damaged it enough that it wound up dying as a result. After seeing that his favorite cherry tree had been killed, Washington's father angrily confronted him, demanding to know what had happened to the tree. Washington replied, "I cannot tell a lie, father. You know I cannot tell a lie. I cut it with my little hatchet." Rather than being punished, the young George Washington was praised for his honesty. It's a great story about the bravery and integrity of the first American president, and it almost certainly never happened. The story was invented by Mason Locke Weems, a traveling bookseller and the author of the first biography written about Washington. The former president had died in 1799, and Weems published his book the following year in 1800. It was an instant success, but the story wasn't even originally included. Weems didn't add the apocryphal tale until the 5th edition of the book in 1806, meaning it was almost certainly just a piece of fiction. Today's episode is brought to you by the Paperlike 2.1 screen potential, which absolutely allows you to unlock your iPad's full potential. If you've been using an iPad, it's too shiny, it doesn't really feel like paper. Well, Paperlike makes it feel like paper, and then you can draw on it. And I thought when they first approached me about sponsoring, I was like, I mean, surely Apple will have thought of this. If the screen is better with a paper texture, Apple will do that. So I was quite skeptical beginning it. It arrives, I put it in, and I'm like, oh my lord, Apple were actually wrong, and I have had this thing on there ever since, and it just makes everything better. Not only is it amazing, like, to draw on, you could just, excuse my terrible handwriting, but you could just draw on it like that. Love the paper, like you see the heart, it's awful, but it is easy to draw. And not only that, it stops reflections. So normally, this would be very, very reflective, but it's minimally reflective, which is super nice. It uses something called nanodots, so you have the experience of a tactile response. Even with the Apple Pen, you don't need to change that at all. It just works perfectly. It makes taking notes and such things actually enjoyable. So look, if you're ready to revolutionize your digital workflow, dive into the world of Paperlike at paperlike.com/side projects and discover why creators worldwide are singing its praises, including me. I mean, I get paid to, but I wouldn't have done this if I didn't think it was amazing. It's a fantastic product. Anyway, thanks to Paperlike for today's sponsorship, and now back to today's video. George Washington and the silver dollar. Next, let's have a look at another story about Washington that may have more of a basis in reality. He was an active and athletic man, and it's often reported that he took part in the common pastime of distance throwing. This has led to superhuman descriptions of his strength, including a feat in which Washington threw a silver dollar clear across the Potomac River, or possibly the Delaware River. These stories are impossible exaggerations, as the silver dollar didn't exist until Washington was in his 60s, and the Potomac is over a mile wide. However, the original story came from his step-grandson, George Washington Parke Custis. According to the grandson, it was a piece of slate roughly the size of a silver dollar that Washington had thrown, and that it was a narrow part of the Rappahannock River near Washington's childhood home. With some parts of the river narrowing to about 250 feet, this was much more plausible, though still very impressive. In 1936, the legend was put to the test by Baseball Hall of Famer Walter Big Train Johnson to celebrate Washington's 204th birthday. Johnson was taken to a part of the river estimated to be 380 feet across and given 3 attempts. The first fell just short of the opposite bank, and the second barely crossed the river. Not wanting to disappoint, Johnson threw the third coin clear over the heads of some 2,000 spectators on the opposite side of the river. The historic memento was then retrieved by Peter Yon. When questioned by reporters what he intended to do with the coin, Yon replied, "I cannot tell a lie. I'm going to sell it to the highest bidder." Nero fiddled while Rome burned. Nero is known for being a cruel emperor, and there is the oft-cited anecdote that he fiddled while Rome burnt. It is true that Nero cared more about his own musical and artistic endeavors than he did about the welfare of the Roman people, though if there was any truth to this story, Nero would have been playing the lyre rather than the fiddle. The story is often attributed to Roman historian Tacitus, though he never actually made this claim. According to Tacitus and many other sources, Nero was 35 miles away when the Great Fire of Rome broke out, and he quickly returned to help coordinate the relief efforts. However, Tacitus did insinuate that Nero may have orchestrated the fire and that he used it for his own benefit by building his grand palace in the area that the fire had devastated. It's unclear what the origin of this apocryphal tale was, but the intent was clear: to portray Nero as a heartless and indifferent leader, more interested in himself than in the subjects he was supposed to be ruling over. It's certainly not an unfair characterization of the Roman emperor, even if this story didn't happen. Zeno's paradoxes of motion. The Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea is famous for his motion paradoxes. The argument states that which is in locomotion must arrive at the halfway stage before it arrives at its goal. That certainly makes sense and seems to be obviously true, but Zeno used this paradox to argue that all motion was impossible. Let's say you want to run a mile. Before you can finish the mile, you must run half a mile, but before you can finish the second half mile, you must run a quarter of a mile, then an eighth, a 16th, and so on. The remaining distance can be divided in half an infinite number of times, so the runner must complete an infinite number of tasks before arriving at the destination. Because a person cannot complete infinite tasks in a finite amount of time, Zeno argued that it was impossible to ever reach a destination. Using the same arguments on the front end of the journey, he also argued that it was impossible for a person to start moving as well, and thus all motion was an illusion. In his writings, the Greek philosopher Simplicus wrote that upon hearing Zeno's argument, the aptly named Diogenes the Cynic stood up and walked around disproving the idea that motion was impossible. Of course, this story almost certainly never happened. Zeno was only about 11 years old when Diogenes died, and Simplicus was writing about it several centuries later. But true or not, it was a fantastic mic drop moment for Diogenes. Behold a man. Diogenes' alleged antics didn't end with Zeno. This entire episode could probably be filled with apocryphal stories of Greece's most hilariously antagonistic philosopher, but we'll stick with just one more for now. What it means to be human was of great interest to the ancient Greeks, and interest in that question never really went away. This was not only the subject of many philosophical debates, but of scientific debates as well. Plato sought to create a scientific definition of what a man was, and settled on declaring that humans were defined as featherless bipeds. It's not a terrible definition, as only humans and birds are bipedal, so this combination was rather uniquely human. Upon hearing this definition, Diogenes went home and plucked all the feathers off of a chicken. He then attended Plato's next lecture, and when Plato repeated his definition, Diogenes held up the bald chicken, declaring, "Behold, a man." Plato amended his definition to include with broad, flat nails, seemingly missing the entire point of Diogenes' criticism. As popular as this story is, it doesn't appear in any ancient Greek texts. We can just hope that Diogenes was really as entertaining as all the apocryphal stories make him out to be. Detachable shirt collars. In the late 1700s, high collars for men were all the rage. The higher and stiffer the collar a man had, the more wealthy and important he must be. While many people today would consider this somewhat ridiculous trend to be a fashion crime, it wasn't actually a victimless crime. Those collars needed to be washed and starched each time they were worn, and this task became one of the many jobs of irritated wives. One man's wife allegedly became so annoyed with the whole situation that she decided to do something about it. After a week of work, the husband would have 5 shirts that were perfectly clean except for the collars, and she would have to spend time washing and starching them all. Fed up with washing clean shirts, she cut the collars off of her husband's shirts, washing and starching them separately as a way to save time. This is the claimed origin of detachable shirt collars, which became an entire industry starting in the 1820s. No name is ever given for this woman, so the entire story was likely invented as a marketing tactic to get women to encourage their husbands to buy these collars. Judgment of Solomon. The Judgment of Solomon is one of the most famous ancient stories, constantly being referenced and parodied throughout pop culture. In the story, 2 women who lived in the same house went before Solomon along with an infant child. Both women had given birth at around the same time, but one of the children had died in its sleep. They each claimed that the surviving baby was theirs and asked Solomon to rule on the matter. Solomon called for his sword and declared that the child would be cut in half, with each woman receiving half a baby. One woman agreed to this judgment, saying that if she couldn't have the baby, then no one could have it. The other begged Solomon to spare the child's life and just give it to the other mother. Solomon declared that the latter woman was the true mother, as a mother would do anything to save the life of her child, even if it meant giving it up. The story first appeared in the Book of Kings. As we previously discussed on this channel, much of that particular book of the Bible is a reasonably accurate chronicle of Jewish history. However, while there is a small amount of archaeological evidence suggesting King Solomon did exist, the biblical stories of his reign are regarded as being far more embellished than most of the Book of Kings. This story likely never happened, and was just a popular anecdote to demonstrate Solomon's wisdom. Albert Einstein failed maths. For generations, Einstein's early academic career has been a source of inspiration for those struggling in school as well as for the gifted but lazy underachievers. After all, everyone knows that Einstein failed maths as a child. Some versions of the story say it was because he had trouble understanding the material, and others say it was because he found it boring and just didn't care. But is there any truth to this famous story? No, not at all. It's Albert Einstein. Do you really think that he failed mathematics? It's unclear exactly where this myth originated, but it was ubiquitous well before he died. In 1935, a rabbi at Princeton showed Einstein a newspaper article making this claim. He reportedly laughed and said, "Before I was 15, I had mastered differential and integral calculus." The only kernel of truth of this story is that Einstein was a somewhat lazy student. He had very poor attendance during college, instead choosing to copy notes off one of his friends in the physics program. But despite this, he was still at the top of his class. The only poor grade Einstein seems to have received in any class was from one university professor who took a personal offense to how often he skipped class, despite him excelling on the exams. Et tu, Brute. On March 15th, 44 BC, Julius Caesar was surrounded and assassinated by around 40 Roman senators. After taking stock of his various attackers, he spoke his final words to one who was very close to him. Et tu, Brute. The story of Julius Caesar is inseparable from these famous last words, but Caesar never said this. The quote first appeared in William Shakespeare's play about Caesar. That's not to say that it isn't somewhat based in reality, but there is debate among historians about Caesar's last words. When the attack began, Caesar said in Latin, "Ista quidem vis est," or "but this is violence." There are two common theories, both of which date back to at least the 2nd century AD. Some accounts claim those were his last words, and that he said nothing further once the stabbing began. Others claimed that he then spoke the words, "You too, child," somewhat similar to the famous "Et tu, Brute." However, if Caesar really did say those words, it's reported that he said them in Greek rather than in Latin. If he did say that, it's also unclear whether the comment was even directed at Marcus Brutus, or if it was meant to be for Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, who he referred to as being like a son to him, and who many believed was in fact his illegitimate child. Benjamin Franklin's kite. In June 1752, Benjamin Franklin tied a key to a string and flew it during a thunderstorm. The key was struck by lightning, and thus Franklin discovered electricity. That's how the story was originally told, though more recently it's become common knowledge that people already understood the existence of electricity and that Franklin was merely trying to prove lightning was made up of electricity. Although the story is considered apocryphal, with many historians doubting its authenticity, the origin of this story is a letter written by Franklin himself. However, in the letter, Franklin merely described the experiment. He never stated when or even if he had actually conducted it. 15 years later, Joseph Priestley's book History and Present Status of Electricity recounted the tale, presumably with additional details provided to him by Franklin. While Priestley claims that Franklin and his son did conduct the experiment, there was no claim that the key was struck by lightning. If it had been, Franklin almost certainly would have died. We know this because others died while conducting lightning rod experiments described by Franklin. According to the book, the kite was drawn back down to the ground after flying in the storm, and Franklin felt an electrical charge on the key when he touched it. It had picked up ambient electrical charge in the air. Benjamin Franklin's national bird. It's tradition to eat turkey on Thanksgiving in the United States, but according to a popular story, this wouldn't be the case if Benjamin Franklin had his way. This story started to circulate in newspapers when the United States was celebrating its 100th birthday, and it was based on a letter that Franklin wrote to his daughter. In the letter, Franklin criticized the bald eagle, calling it lazy and of bad moral character. He went on to say that the turkey was a much more respectable bird, and withal a true original native of America. But while Franklin may have preferred the turkey to the eagle, he never nominated it to be the national bird, nor did he make any of these comments publicly. The context of the letter was to criticize the original design for the Great Seal of the United States, as he felt the design of the eagle made it look more like a turkey. This was what led to his tangent on avian morality. However, Franklin didn't want the turkey on the Great Seal either. He had been given the chance to design the seal several years earlier, and his proposed design featured neither an eagle nor a turkey, but rather Moses parting the Red Sea. What that had to do with the United States is anybody's guess, which is probably why it was rejected. The Gordian knot. When Alexander the Great set out on his conquest of Asia Minor, he had a legendary encounter with the Gordian knot. In Gordium, in Phrygia, there was an extremely intricate knot connecting an ox cart to a post. The knot had been tied by King Gordius, a peasant who was declared king and became the foster father to the eventual King Midas. An oracle declared that any man who could untangle the elaborate knot would become ruler of all of Asia. When Alexander heard this story, naturally he wanted to untie the knot. According to the legend, he tried to untie the knot conventionally, but to no avail. He then reasoned that it didn't matter how the knot became undone, just that it did, so he pulled his sword out and cut the knot in half. Now, this is a fun story, demonstrating how seemingly complex problems can be easily solved with brute force, although that's not necessarily a great lesson, is it? But did it happen? Well, allegedly it sort of did. According to Greek historian Aristobulus, who accompanied Alexander on his campaign, they really did encounter the Gordian knot. However, Aristobulus described a more clever solution devised by Alexander. Rather than cutting the knot in half, he stated that Alexander removed the linchpin from the yoke of the ox cart, freeing one end of the rope so that it could be easily untied. While this story is considered more plausible, it may still have been a piece of fiction designed by Aristobulus to legitimize Alexander's expansion of the Greek Empire. Columbus proved the Earth was round. In 1492, Columbus dared to do the unthinkable and sail west to his inevitable doom. Everyone knew the Earth was flat, but Columbus was a brave and daring explorer who sought to prove them all wrong. But before they could even leave port, Columbus had to convince the ignorant and superstitious sailors that the Earth really was round. And of course, we all know this isn't true, and it's been well established since ancient times that the Earth is round. However, the origin of this myth is surprisingly interesting. It's often attributed to the 1828 biography of Columbus by Washington Irving, titled A History of the Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus. Irving was a fiction writer, and this supposed biography was a heavily fictionalized and unrealistic retelling of history. But while this book perpetuated the myth that people in the Middle Ages believed that the Earth was flat, it was part of a much larger trend. This began in the 1600s as a coordinated effort by Protestants to disparage Catholic teaching. In the 1800s, the myth became extremely widespread, thanks to both revisionist histories, like Irving's book, as well as an increasing belief that science and religion had been extremely antagonistic in the Middle Ages. The latter belief completely ignored the fact that many scientists were also members of the clergy. Columbus's ships. While we're on the topic of Columbus, children across the United States have learned for centuries that he sailed to America on the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. However, those were not actually the names of the three ships. Ships at the time were almost invariably named after saints, so while the Santa Maria is correct, the other two names were not. Sailors would normally give nicknames to boats, which is what the names Nina and Pinta would have been. Pinta was Spanish for painted one, and Nina was Spanish for little girl. We know that the Nina's real name was the Santa Clara, but the actual name of the Pinta is unknown. Catherine the Great's death. Catherine the Great was Russia's longest reigning empress and accomplished a great deal during her time on the throne. However, one of the things she was most known for was the many lovers she took as empress. Catherine would invite a man to be with her until she got bored of him, at which point she would give him some land, serfs, and a pension and send him on his way. This led to a lot of rumors and urban legends, the most famous of which was about Catherine's cause of death. According to the tale, Catherine was engaging in amorous activities with her favorite horse. The harness that was suspending the horse broke, and the horse crushed Catherine to death. Although this apocryphal tale began circulating immediately after her death and persisted for centuries, it was nothing but slander. Catherine actually died from a stroke, and the story about her horse was one of many salacious rumors started by her political enemies to discredit the empress. The salting of Carthage. The Third Punic Wars took place between Rome and Carthage from 149 BC through 146 BC. Although the siege of Carthage took 3 full years, the Romans were eventually successful in their mission. But it wasn't enough to win. They had to send a message. To that end, the Roman general Scipio Alamanus razed all the buildings in the city and sowed the ground with salt so that nothing would ever grow there again. Or so the story goes, and it was a pretty believable one. There are many ancient references to salting the earth, and the salting of Carthage is among the most famous, second only to the biblical account of the salting of Shechem. However, while ancient sources do mention this practice, it is unclear how often it actually happened. When it did, it was likely a small symbolic gesture, possibly meant to place a curse on the conquered land. Actually salting the ground to prevent agriculture, which would have required massive amounts of salt, would have been prohibitively expensive and a logistical nightmare. However, it's unlikely that this happened to Carthage even in a symbolic fashion. While Scipio did raise Carthage and the Romans were intent on the city remaining in ruins, there are no ancient references to the salting of Carthage. The first book about the Third Punic War to include this detail wasn't written until the 19th century. Because the practice was believed to be common in ancient times, it's believed that the author added the detail simply to make the story more interesting in a plausible way. Historians of the past, everybody. Stockbrokers jumping out of windows. The 1920s was a great time to be in the stock market. The market was experiencing a speculative bubble, inflating stock prices to completely unreasonable heights. However, as investors were reminded in the years 2000, 2008, 2015, and 2018, to name just a few, these speculative bubbles always burst. In October of 1929, the first stock market crash began. Between Black Monday and Black Tuesday, the market dropped over 23%. This was not an isolated incident, and the market had already been in sharp decline, but it remains the largest two-day drop in history. People were panicked, and stockbrokers began jumping out of windows to end their own lives as they crashed headfirst into Wall Street, just like their stocks had. It was even said that there were lines of brokers waiting for a free window. This was the initial reporting in newspapers, and comedians quickly jumped onto the story to help perpetuate the rumors. However, there is not a single verified instance of this actually happening. While the Great Depression did see higher suicide rates than the 1920s had, there was no sudden spike in October of 1929. Most people accepted that the world had gone to chose to do their best to survive. The stockbrokers never jumped out of the window. Let them eat cake. Marie Antoinette was the last queen of France before the French Revolution, and the revolution did not end well for her or her husband, King Louis XVI. They were both beheaded after an angry populace removed them from power. Of all the stories of Marie Antoinette, none is more famous than when she was informed that the peasants had no bread to eat. She was reported as saying, "Let them eat cake." However, there's no evidence that she actually ever said this, nor is it even a proper translation of the quote people have attributed to her, though the sentiment is largely the same. In French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau's autobiography, he made reference to an unnamed princess who, upon hearing that the peasants had no bread, replied, "Qu'ils mangeaient de la brioche." This translates to, "Let them eat brioche," which is a fancier, sweeter bread, but still, it's a bread, it's not cake. However, while not published until 1782, Rousseau is said to have completed the book in 1767, 3 years before Marie Antoinette even arrived in France. In reality, stories like this had existed for centuries in different languages all across the world. It was just a joke meant to show how out of touch the ruling class were with the people over who they were supposed to be ruling. Martin Luther's 95 Theses. On October 31st, 1517, Martin Luther walked to the doors of All Saints Church in Wittenberg, Germany, and nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the church. It was a bold act of defiance that kicked off the Reformation and Luther's split from the Catholic Church. At least, that was what we've been led to believe. But it didn't quite go down like that. It is believed that Luther never nailed his theses to the church doors. He simply mailed them to the archbishop. Luther was a priest and a devout Catholic, and he wasn't looking to form his own religion just to fix the church. His main issue was with the practice of indulgences, the church's way of raising money by telling people they could buy their way into heaven. His complaints were ignored and things spiraled out of control, resulting in Luther's excommunication. Historians agree that the theses were never nailed to the church door, particularly because Luther was a bit of a braggart, but he never claimed to have done this, only saying that he mailed them to the archbishop. However, even if it had happened, it wouldn't have been the grandiose display that it was made out to be. Church doors were essentially the city bulletin board, and people nailed documents to them all the time so that they would be seen by most people. Lady Godiva's Ride. Lady Godiva was the wife of Leofric, Earl of Mercia, in the 11th century. She felt pity for the peasants and the oppressive taxes her husband imposed on them, so she continually pleaded with him to lower their tax burden. Finally, sick of hearing her ask, Leofric told her that he would lower taxes if she rode through the streets naked on a horse. To his surprise, she agreed. Out of respect for Lady Godiva and what she was doing for them, all of the people of the city remained indoors during her ride except for one. That man, a tailor named Tom, gave us the expression Peeping Tom. The story is so iconic that it inspired multiple paintings and sculptures by famous artists, but there's actually no evidence that it ever happens. This story wasn't first recorded until over 2 centuries after her death, making it virtually impossible to have happened. Though Godiva and Leofric were real people, contemporary historians made no reference to Godiva other than her being married to an earl and her considerable donations to the church. If a famous naked ride took place, it seems like the sort of thing that they might have mentioned. Eureka! Archimedes was a Greek mathematician and scientist who was well known during his time. He was summoned by King Nero II of Syracuse to inspect a crown that had been commissioned. Nero had supplied the gold for the crown, but he wanted Archimedes to determine if the gold had been adulterated with cheaper metals like silver. The only caveat was that Archimedes could not damage the crown, which was likely in the shape of a wreath. Although this question would be easily answered if Archimedes knew the weight and volume of the crown, its highly irregular shape made calculating the volume a difficult problem. Archimedes went home to soak in the bath and think about the problem, and when he saw the water level in the bath rise as he sat down, he realized he could use the displacement of the water to measure the crown's volume. He then jumped out of the bath and ran naked through the streets yelling "Eureka!" excited that he could answer the king's question. While this story does appear in ancient historical accounts such as the work of Vitruvius, the story is still somewhat apocryphal. Archimedes certainly could have solved such a problem for King Nero, but running naked through the streets was likely a playful embellishment added by the historians. From a logical standpoint, he is also more likely to have used Archimedes' principle of buoyancy rather than the displacement of water, as the latter would have required measurements that were impractically precise given the technology at the time. Archimedes' death ray. There are many apocryphal stories about Archimedes, but the other most famous one involves the siege of Syracuse during the First Punic War. During the siege, it was said that Archimedes used a series of large mirrors to focus the light from the sun onto oncoming Roman ships, setting them ablaze while they were still in the water. This has been referred to both as Archimedes' heat ray and his death ray. It's a popular story that lines up with people's belief about the brilliant inventor. However, the earliest references to this death ray came 4 centuries after the war. Even then, it was only stated that Archimedes set fire to the boats, and the author didn't specify how. Still, the theory seemed somewhat plausible, and numerous attempts have been made to create this event using only materials that would have been available at the time. Despite the best efforts of Mythbusters and other teams trying to recreate Archimedes' invention, they have been universally unsuccessful. Even though it's theoretically possible that it could work, the logistics of aiming the mirrors perfectly at a moving target make it incredibly unlikely that this really happened. Archimedes was killed during the siege by the Romans, so if he did have some clever way to make his death ray work, then the plans died with him. William Tell's apple. Everyone has heard the famous story of William Tell and the apple, but for the people of Switzerland, it's much more than that. The legend goes that after refusing to remove his hat, the tyrannical Habsburg bailiff Albrecht Gassler ordered Tell to shoot an apple off of his son's head at a distance of 120 paces. If he failed, they would both be put to death. Tell loaded his crossbow, counted out 120 paces, and then fired, taking the apple clear off of his son's head. When Gessler asked why there was a second arrow in his jacket, Tell said that if he killed his son, he would have killed Gessler next. This is the part most people know, but the story goes on from there, with Tell being imprisoned, escaping, assassinating Gessler, and helping lead the rebellion that led to the formation of the Old Swiss Confederacy. Naturally, Tell became a national hero, but there's one problem. Not only is this story a complete fabrication, there's no evidence that Tell actually even existed. The first account of this story was written hundreds of years after it happened, and the author got the date wrong by 16 years. If that wasn't damning enough, another story, written over 300 years before this allegedly took place, was written by King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark and a man named Palnatoke. It's nearly the exact same story, with Palnatoke and Bluetooth taking the roles of Tell and Gessler. Death by ham sandwich. Cass Elliot, also known as Mama Cass, was a beloved member of the 1960s group The Mamas and the Papas, as well as an accomplished solo artist. And the story goes that she died choking on a ham sandwich. It's such a well-known tale that it was even joked about in Austin Powers. However, while we know that this was not Cass's true cause of death, it wasn't a total fabrication. When Dr. Anthony Greenberg saw Cass's body in the room where she had died, his first instinct was that she died of asphyxiation. He noted that she'd been lying down while eating a ham sandwich and drinking a Coke, which he deemed a dangerous activity, especially for someone overweight. His initial analysis was that she had choked to death from the sandwich. The public immediately latched onto this story because it was deemed a humorous cause of death. Cass's weight had made her the constant butt of people's jokes, and this fit the narrative that they had constructed around her perfectly. So much so that few people took notice when her actual cause of death was revealed after her autopsy. Though it was related to her weight, Cass did not die choking on a sandwich. She had been consistently overweight, but also routinely went on dangerous crash diets to lose weight for photo shoots and the like. The combination of these crash diets and being generally overweight put a tremendous amount of strain on her body, and she died of a heart attack. She just happened to coincidentally be eating a ham sandwich when that happened. The original vampire. Prince of Wallachia, Vlad Dracula, or Vlad the Impaler, is often referred to as the world's first vampire. While vampire legends predated Vlad, vampires obviously aren't real, whereas Vlad was, allowing him to earn this title. Vlad was a brutal and ruthless leader, known for impaling his enemies on spikes. He is often cited as drinking the blood of his enemies as well, with the somewhat toned-down version of the story being that he would walk among the impaled bodies while eating dinner, dipping his bread in their blood. Since Vlad was such a feared ruler and was famous for his cruelty and brutality, it's easy to see how this rumor would have spread. Even if it wasn't true, it would certainly be to his benefit if everyone believed it. Modern historians have always questioned how realistic this story was, with it being dismissed as legend and hyperbole. However, new research may have provided a definitive and somewhat shocking answer. According to the study published in 2023, Vlad definitively did not drink any blood, human or animal. In fact, he was probably a vegetarian. Skin and saliva samples were taken from a letter written by Vlad, and expert analysis showed a complete lack of animal proteins. This would only be possible if Vlad was a vegetarian or possibly even vegan. Of course, that surprising fact doesn't make him any less brutal. Oscar Wilde's last words. Oscar Wilde was impoverished and in poor health for his last few years. The end of his life was spent confined to his bed in room 16 in the Hôtel d'Alsace in Saint-Amand-des-Prés, Paris, before he finally died from meningitis. On his deathbed, it's said that Wilde spoke his final words to a friend, author and journalist Carta. "My wallpaper and I are fighting a duel to the death. One of us has got to go." It's a good line, and complaining about the aesthetics of his dreary hotel room while dying certainly seemed to fit Wilde's personality. Last words are notoriously difficult to verify. However, this story is most likely only a slight exaggeration. Pratt wrote that Wilde spoke these words to her, but not on his deathbed. Instead, she said that he made this remark weeks before his death during one of his final trips outside his hotel room. So while it is likely that Wilde said the famous quote attributed to him, the idea of them being his last words were a later embellishment to make the story more interesting. The Betsy Ross flag. The original first American flag, featuring 13 stars and stripes, is often referred to as the Betsy Ross flag in honor of its creator. Elizabeth Ross was a Philadelphia seamstress who had sewn flags during the American Revolution and in the decades that followed, and she was personally commissioned by George Washington to create the design for the first official United States flag. This is an iconic story about the founding of the United States, and Betsy Ross sewing the original flag was even immortalized on a US stamp. However, virtually every part of this story is fiction. Betsy Ross really did spend 50 years sewing flags, mostly for the military, but there's no evidence she designed the so-called Betsy Ross flag. Even if she had, it was actually the second official flag rather than the first. The original story, as told by her family, was that Washington had a sketch of the design that he wanted, and that Ross's only design contribution was to switch from 6-pointed stars to 5-pointed stars, as they'd be easier to manufacture. This evolved over time into her designing the entire flag. While her grandson may have believed the more humble family lore he presented of Ross only changing the shape of the stars, most people spreading this story knew that it was entirely fictional. But when her grandson came forward with the story, it was just after the Civil War leading up to the nation's centennial celebration. There was a strong desire to create wholesome American lore that could help unite the nation, so the story was publicized with no regard given to its veracity. Burned at the stake. The Salem witch trials are a well-known part of American history, and every Halloween, nearly 1 million tourists come to see the city where it all went down and make traffic miserable for everybody else. It began when two young girls, Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, began experiencing fits symptomatic of bewitchment. They named the witches, who they believed to be casting spells on them, and the witches were burned at the stake. This set off a cascade of events in which dozens of innocent people were executed after being accused of witchcraft by young girls. While this is how most people remember it, it's not exactly what happened. To start, most of these events didn't actually take place in modern-day Salem. The trials were primarily held in Salem town, which is now Salem, but the people involved were all in Salem village, which is present-day Danvers. More importantly, nobody was burned at the stake. This mistake is likely the result of confusion more than anything else. Witch trials occurred throughout Europe as well, and in Europe it was customary for the witches to be burnt. In Salem, however, the standard method of execution was hanging. Of course, this ultimately worked out better for the town of Salem. Burning the victims wouldn't have left any meaningful landmarks, but Gallows Hill is now a popular stop for tourists. War of the Worlds. On October 30th, 1938, CBS Radio decided to air a very special Halloween broadcast. Live on air, Orson Welles and the Mercury Theatre were going to read a radio dramatization of H.G. Wells's famous novel War of the Worlds. The show was written in the style of a news broadcast, so it opened with a disclaimer that what was being presented was a fictional radio play rather than a breaking news bulletin. However, not everybody caught that announcement. The fake newscast was airing alongside the Chase and Sanborn Hour, a popular show that had only become more of a hit with the addition of ventriloquism ventriloquist Edgar Bergen and his dummy Charlie McCarthy. Because ventriloquism apparently translates amazingly well to radio. After the first comedy sketch, there was a musical number, and many listeners changed stations to CBS, having missed the initial disclaimer. This resulted in widespread panic. Depending on how much of the show people heard before losing their they believed either there was a major natural disaster, an invasion from the Germans, or an actual Martian invasion. That's how newspapers reported it anyway. But it was all a lie. Radio news had been rapidly gaining popularity, and it was stealing advertising revenue from print newspapers. In an ironic twist of fate, the newspapers decided to use the fictional news drama to paint radio news as untrustworthy by knowingly printing their own lies. Newton and the Apple. Isaac Newton was enjoying a peaceful day in his garden at Woolsthorpe Manor in Lincolnshire, England. As he sat beneath an apple tree, an apple fell off the tree and landed directly on his head. The sudden impact turned Newton's thoughts to that of gravitation, an attractive force that pulled things down toward the Earth. It's a well-known story, though even children assume that it's apocryphal when they hear it. The idea that Newton's laws were derived merely by being bonked on the head with an apple sounds too preposterous to be true. However, it's not actually that far off the real story. The story dates back to a biography of Newton that had been written by one of his friends, and the story about the apple was told to him directly by Newton. Though he never claimed that the apple hit him on the head, an apple was indeed the inspiration for his work with gravity. Rather than being struck by the apple, Newton merely observed an apple fall within his line of sight. It got him wondering why an apple falling from a tree would always fall straight down towards the earth rather than at an angle or even instead of falling upwards. The idea of an apple falling up obviously sounded ludicrous, but without Newton explaining how gravity worked, there was no real scientific explanation as to why. Battle of Thermopylae. Everyone knows the story of the Battle of Thermopylae. It was one of the most famous battles of ancient times and was immortalized in the comic book and subsequent movie 300. During the battle, 300 Spartans stood alone against a Persian army numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The Persians would have to travel through the bottlenecked pass of Thermopylae, effectively negating their numbers advantage. The battle lasted for 3 days, until the Spartans were dead to the last man, but with 20,000 Persian deaths, Xerxes decided to withdraw his army rather than pressing onward to engage a larger Spartan army. It's an incredible story that demonstrates both the skill of Spartan soldiers and the importance of battle tactics, but while the basic idea of the story is true, it is a complete exaggeration. Herodotus recorded the battle as having 4,000 Greek deaths, something that would be impossible if there were only 300 men there at the start. A Greek army of roughly 7,000 men fought against the Persians for 2 full days. After the second day, Leonidas learned that the Persians had found an alternate path and were moving to flank them, so he dismissed much of the Greek army. Though only 300 Spartans remained for the final day of the battle, another 2,000 Greek soldiers stayed as well. The Greeks also didn't all fight to their deaths, as it was reported that most of the 400 Thebans eventually surrendered to the Persian army. It was still impressive that the Greek army was able to hold the position successfully as long as they did, but the story has been exaggerated over time to depict the Spartans as effectively superhuman. Chastity belts. We can all imagine the scene so vividly. It's the Middle Ages, and you start to get frisky with some comely lass. But as you lift up her frock, you suddenly find yourself face to face with a chastity belt, padlocked shut by either her father to prevent premarital sex or her husband to prevent infidelity while he's off at war. It looks like you're going to have to settle for another night of medieval hand stuff. It's an extremely common depiction that has existed for centuries, and it's entirely fictional. The idea that chastity belts were common in the Middle Ages seems to have taken hold in the 18th and 19th centuries. Not because there was any evidence that they existed, just because the idea of a chastity belt made their ancestors seem backwards and repressed, making them come off as much more enlightened by comparison. While some references to chastity belts exist from the Middle Ages, they are exceedingly rare. Any references that do exist are either metaphorical or satirical in nature, and there are no actual chastity belts from the time period that have ever been found. The earliest known sketch of one of these devices is from a book written in 1405, which at first suggests that they may have existed. However, this book also has sketches of devices to make the wearer invisible and is filled with fart jokes, so it's hard to believe that this sketch wasn't also just a joke. Atlantis. The lost city of Atlantis was a utopian society located on an island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, whatever that means. They were an advanced naval empire controlling nearly all western portions of the known world. Then, after a failed attempt to conquer Athens, the Atlanteans fell out of favor with the gods and their island was cast into the sea. Most people understand that this was fiction, but some of the nuance has caused a lot of confusion. To start, there are still those that believe Atlantis was a real place and have dedicated their lives to finding it. To those people, we wish them the best of luck in their endeavor. But as for those of us who are aware there was never an Atlantis, how important this piece of fiction was often gets misunderstood. Despite its fame and notoriety, the story of Atlantis was a relatively minor aspect of 2 books written by Plato. There was not some rich oral tradition about this lost city, nor was Atlantis a major part of the public consciousness at the time. It was simply an allegory that Plato invented to try and prove a point, though exactly what his point was remains a matter of considerable debate. Dr. Seuss's most famous quote. Dr. Seuss is known for a lot of things. He invented the word nerd, made World War II propaganda films, and taught generations of kids that it's okay to invite strangers into your house and violate all of your parents' rules as long as you clean up and don't get caught. While Dr. Seuss has written a lot of memorable books, the constant use of nonsense words invented to fit the rhyming scheme prevent them from being highly quotable. However, there is one quote for which Theodore Seuss Geisel is most famous. Be who you are and say what you feel, because those who mind don't matter, and those who matter don't mind. It's a beautiful sentiment, and it certainly sounds like something Seuss would say, aside from the lack of rhymes, but he never actually did, or at the very least, there's no record of him ever saying it. Some of the earliest references to this quote are from the 1940s, and in both instances, it is the punchline in a joke about difficult seating arrangements at a party. Even earlier than that, in 1938, the quote appeared in a London-based engineering journal, again used as a punchline. In that instance, the line appeared in quotes despite not being attributed to anyone in particular, suggesting that it was just a common phrase or piece of wisdom at the time. The Bermuda Triangle. In the Atlantic Ocean, there exists a dangerous patch of sea known as the Bermuda Triangle. This vaguely defined area is the triangle roughly formed by Bermuda, Puerto Rico, and the Florida Keys. The area is known for its high rate of crashes, disappearances, and sunken vessels, often under mysterious circumstances. A boat or plane that entered the triangle might never be seen or heard from again. There are many attempts to explain why this area of sea is so cursed, most of which are supernatural in nature. Some offer scientific explanations, such as localized magnetic fields screwing with compasses and navigation equipment. But there is a much simpler explanation for the disappearances in the Bermuda Triangle, which is that it's a lie concocted by writers looking to make money with a sensational story. In reality, there is nothing mysterious going on. Many disappearances were total fabrications, and of those that really happened, ships that were considered missing but arrived late to port were still included in the tally to inflate the numbers and make them look more noteworthy. Considering the Bermuda Triangle is an area of the Atlantic that received exceptionally heavy traffic from boats, planes, and tropical cyclones, there was nothing disproportionate or mysterious about the number of lost vessels. The curse of the billy goat. Sports are full of superstitions, but it's not every day that an actual curse is placed on a team. William Sionis was the owner of the Billy Goat Tavern in Chicago, and as an avid baseball fan, he had gone to Wrigley Field to watch the Chicago Cubs play in the 1945 World Series. And either because he wanted to promote his business or just really loved animals, Sionis brought his pet Billy Goat with him to the game. Others in attendance found this goat Murphy to be disruptive, so Sionis and his pet were asked to leave. Enraged, Sionis placed a curse on the team, condemning them to never play in the World Series again. The Cubs lost the game and the series, and it really seemed like they'd never compete in the World Series again. This is how the story was always told, but it's unclear what, if anything, Sionis said when he was ejected from the stadium. The most common accounts are either that he said nothing, or that he angrily stated, "Them Cubs, they ain't gonna win no more." That doesn't sound like how someone would place a magical curse if curses were actually real, but you can't argue with the results. After losing that World Series in 1945, the Cubs wouldn't appear in another World Series until 2016, 72 years after the curse was placed, and 106 years since they'd last won. They did win that year, reportedly breaking the curse. Cleopatra's pearl wine. Cleopatra and Mark Antony were having a lovely dinner banquet together. Suddenly, Cleopatra removed a priceless pearl from her earring and dropped it in a glass of wine. Once it dissolved, she drank the wine with a pearl inside it. Some sources say that Cleopatra did this to show her indifference to wealth, and others say that she did it to prove that she could consume the wealth of an entire nation in a single meal. Regardless of her motivation, the way the story is most commonly told now is that Cleopatra dropped the pearl into her wine without provocation. However, the original story, as told by Pliny the Elder, is a little bit different. In the original version, Cleopatra and Antony had made a wager about who would serve the most expensive feast, and this was Cleopatra's way of winning. Pliny also said that the glass was vinegar rather than wine. In ancient times, this story was regarded as a real historical event, though it was later deemed apocryphal. However, that may not actually be the case. According to a 2010 paper published in the National Library of Medicine, the story is actually plausible. Their research concluded that the concentration of acetic acid found in vinegar made from wine was ideal for dissolving a pearl, making this story at the very least plausible. President Taft's unimaginable girth. President William Howard Taft was one of the United States' most accomplished presidents. Not only did he serve as president, he went on to teach at Yale before being appointed to the US Supreme Court and becoming Chief Justice. But despite all of this, there is only one thing that people really remember about Taft. He was a big dude. At 6 feet tall and 340 pounds, Taft was America's fattest president. As the story goes, Taft was so fat that he actually got stuck inside a bathtub in the White House. The rumor was popular even back when Taft was president, and its origins are impossible to nail down. What we can tell you, however, is that it is entirely untrue. Of course, that's not to say that a standard bathtub being unable to accommodate the president was not a concern. Instead, he had a custom bathtub installed, one that was large enough to seat 4 typical size men comfortably. When going to inspect the progress on the Panama Canal, Taft even had a special bathtub installed aboard the USS North Carolina for his trip. The tub was over 7 feet long and 3.5 feet wide. Origin of the potato chip. If you've ever worked a retail job, you've undoubtedly had at least one nightmare customer. For George Crumb, a chef at Moon's Lake House in Saratoga Springs, New York, that customer walked through the door on August 24th, 1853. The customer ordered a plate of French fries, but he kept sending them back to the kitchen. Each time Crumb made the fries, the customer complained that they were either too thick, too soggy, or not salted enough. After finally getting annoyed with the customer, Crumb cut some potatoes as thin as he could, fried them until they were crispy, and doused them with salt. To his surprise, the customer loved them and Saratoga chips were born. That brand of chips still exists to this day, but is there any truth to the story? Well, we can't say for sure. It's certainly possible that Crumb made potato chips while trying to please a pain-in-the-ass customer, but the story may have been invented later as a marketing tool. Either way, it's somewhat irrelevant, as Crumb did not invent potato chip. Though he did help popularize them in the United States, a recipe for potato chips was published in an 1817 cookbook that was a bestseller in both the US and the UK. The recipe book didn't refer to them as potato chips, but there's no disputing that that's what the recipe would make. Signing of the Magna Carta. June the 15th, 1215 is one of the most important dates in history. On that day, King John signed the Magna Carta, widely regarded as the most important document in the development of modern democracy. However, why he signed it is sometimes a matter of disagreement. There are the two most common stories, and then there's the truth. One of the popular versions is that John was tricked into signing the document. He is often viewed as being an incompetent and ineffective leader, with England losing a significant portion of land that it had gained thanks to his father, King Henry II, and his brother, King Richard the Lionheart. John is also typically the villain in stories about Robin Hood, in which he is frequently bested and outsmarted. As such, the idea that he may have been tricked into signing the Magna Carta without understanding it became one of the main narratives. The other common belief is that John signed the Magna Carta out of the goodness of his heart, signing it out of a sense of justice for the people of England. Of course, this is completely at odds with what is known about King John's character. He was known for being spiteful, cruel, tyrannical, and arbitrary in his judgments. In reality, John's feudal barons revolted against him because of his overall behavior. After being confronted with an army much larger than what he would have been able to muster, John was forced to sign the Magna Carta by his barons. President Lincoln's Little Woman. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, which became incredibly popular. The novel was a harsh depiction of life for African American slaves, and it helped turn public opinion in favor of abolition. It was also controversial, with slave owners and fans of slavery in general claiming that it was an inaccurate representation and was just abolitionist propaganda. When the Civil War broke out, Stowe traveled to Washington, D.C. to meet with President Lincoln. He greeted her by saying, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." It's a commonly referenced quote, but there is no evidence that it was ever said. Though the quote gained public attention after spending years as Stowe family law, there is no evidence that Lincoln ever made this specific remark, and Harriet made no reference to the quote herself. That said, it's not entirely impossible either. Though most historians believe the statement by Lincoln was entirely apocryphal, there was one thing that Stowe and her daughter Hattie, who traveled with her to the White House, were very clear on. Lincoln was an absolute riot. Stowe wrote to her husband, "I had a really funny interview with the president," while Hattie said, "I will only say now that it was all very funny, and we were ready to explode with laughter all the while. I am a jelly donut." On June the 26th, 1963, President John F. Kennedy stood in West Berlin in front of the Berlin Wall to give one of the most memorable speeches of the Cold War. He spoke of freedom and democracy, but unfortunately, he made a terrible mistake. JFK was known to struggle with foreign languages, and he ended his speech with the phrase "Ich bin ein Berliner," meaning "I am a jelly donut." The audience erupted with laughter over this gaffe, and German political cartoonists had a field day with the speech for weeks. JFK had meant to say that he was a citizen of Berlin, but adding the article "ein" completely changed the meaning of the sentence. That's the story most people know today, but it originated in a 1983 spy novel, Berlin Game. It was a one-line remark from a fictional character who was an unreliable narrator, but 5 years later it got picked up as actual news. It's almost baffling that this myth has persisted for so long, as footage of the speech is readily readily available. Anyone can see for themselves that nobody laughed at the president, instead erupting in thunderous applause. To start, what he said was in fact grammatically correct. It was written for JFK by his translator, a native German speaker who even gave him a phonetic pronunciation guide so he wouldn't screw it up. And although a Berliner is a type of jelly donut, people in Berlin and the surrounding area had a different word for them anyway. But even if that wasn't the case and the statement did have two possible meanings, it's safe to assume that the German people would have understood what he meant in context. Jimmy Stewart for governor. Despite spending decades in Hollywood, Ronald Reagan was never really a leading man. Women thought he came across as too nice, so he was mainly a character actor relegated to the role of plucky sidekick. It was rare for Reagan to receive top billing in a movie, and half the times that he did, it was only because his co-star was a literal chimpanzee. This was perfectly articulated by Jack Warner of Warner Brothers. When Warner found out that Reagan was running for governor of California, it stated that his immediate reply was, "No, Jimmy Carter for governor, Ronald Reagan for governor's best friend." Despite being reported in Time magazine, it's unclear whether Warner actually made the statement or not. Reagan was known for his sense of humor, so it's quite possible that he made the story up as a joke. Walt Disney was frozen. Aside from being an incredibly adept businessman, Walt Disney was a fan of science fiction and futurism. Though it's now little more than a miniature World's Fair thanks to Walt's brother Roy, the Epcot Center originally stood for Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow. It was meant to be a glimpse into the future, and Disney was often on the cutting edge of technology within the film industry. It only made sense that such a forward-thinking individual would have his body cryogenically frozen upon his death, a theoretical technology that was entering the public consciousness for the first time right around the time Disney died in 1966. The following year, reports came out that this had happened, and everybody just kind of went with it. Not only did it seem to make sense as something Disney would do, but there had been no large funeral. Even back in the 60s, it was common for celebrities to have massive public funerals, so perhaps Disney didn't have one because there was no body to display. And it's true that there wasn't a body to display, but that's because Disney was cremated. He was a notoriously private person, so a large funeral would have been a strange decision. Instead, a small ceremony was held where his family interred his ashes in the family mausoleum. So how did the story start? It seems to have first appeared in a tabloid the year following Disney's death. A writer claimed to have broken into a hospital by posing as an orderly and seen Disney's frozen body with his own eyes. The story got picked up and repeated, first by other tabloids, then by actual respectable news outlets, and it spread simply because people found it believable. Julius Caesar was born by caesarean section. It's long been stated that Julius Caesar was born by caesarean section. It is usually said that the C-section was named after Caesar, though some accounts state that he was instead named after the procedure. He is often reported as being the first person born through this method, claiming it as the reason it was named after him. However, none of this is actually true. Regardless of what they were called, C-sections had been around for quite some time by the time of Caesar's reign and were not an invention of the Romans. The procedure's name comes from Lex Caesare, which was the law governing C-sections. Under the law, it was mandatory that any pregnant woman who died or was dying had to be cut open so the baby could be removed. But while this procedure had already existed for some time, it was nothing like how it exists in modern medicine. Once a woman was cut open, there was no sewing her back up. That's why it was only performed on those who were already dead or dying. Though this rumor about Caesar dates back to at least the 10th century, we do know that it can't be true because Caesar's mother, Aurelia, survived his birth. Alice Cooper's kittens. Alice Cooper was in the business of shocking his fans at concerts, so much so that he is often referred to as the godfather of shock rock. However, one stunt he performed on stage went too far for most people's sensibilities, though apparently not too far for the audience that night. At the start of one show, Cooper took to the stage carrying a bag of kittens with him. He then declared over the microphone, "I refuse to play until all these kittens are dead," before tossing the bag into the audience. Cooper's fans did as their idol had instructed them to do, and the show went on from there. Chances are you find this story to be impossibly absurd, and you'd be correct. However, many outraged parents believed otherwise, and this apocryphal tale has persisted as part of Cooper's mythos, believed by those that seek to vilify music that they find inappropriate. Of course, this wasn't the first time that a story like this had appeared. Before Alice Cooper, a similar story circulated involving Ozzy Osbourne. Years later, an AOL chain letter warned of Marilyn Manson pulling an identical stunt with puppies. These fake reports of grotesque acts were a common way for people to garner support in vilifying anyone whose music they had some sort of moral opposition to. Decades later, Cooper was asked about the rumor during an interview. He laughed and said that he didn't remember it, but that he was probably the one who started the rumor. The cow that caused the Great Fire. Over the course of 3 days, in October 1871, the Great Chicago Fire raged across the city. It destroyed 17,000 buildings, left over 100,000 residents homeless, and claimed the lives of 300 people. And how did this terrible fire begin? Well, that would be Mrs. O'Leary's cow. The fire was believed to have begun at around 8:30 p.m. on October the 8th, in or near the O'Leary's barn on DeCoven Street, as the shed next to their barn was the first building destroyed in the fire. The most popular explanation is that Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over the lantern, and that started the blaze that would engulf the city. There's absolutely no evidence to support this theory, but there was no evidence to support any other theory either. The Midwest was in the middle of an intense and prolonged drought. Strong winds from the southeast would have easily helped a fire spread, and there were widespread fires across the entire region at the time. With how extremely flammable the weather had left the city, even the smallest spark could have caused the fire. Since anything or anyone could have been at fault, and there was no evidence or reason to suspect an intentional act of arson, people likely just decided it was better to blame Mrs. O'Leary's cow rather than to start a witch hunt. Bra burning. The United States saw a large feminist movement in the 1960s and 70s. One of the most iconic and evocative images of this movement were bras being burned. Women were invited to remove their bras, seen as a symbol of male oppression, and cast them into a roaring bonfire. That's how people seem to remember it anyway, and it certainly does paint a rather vivid picture. In fact, the idea paints such a vivid picture that most people never stop to realize that the only images that exist of these bra burnings are the mental images that they conjure in their imaginations, because it never happens. At least, it mostly never happens. The protest that is cited as sparking this movement took place outside the Miss America pageant in 1968. There was a metal trash can, labeled as the Freedom Trash Can, and women were invited to throw things like mops, lipstick, and high heels inside. Some threw bras as well, but they were bras they had brought with them separately. A single passerby saw the protest and carefully removed her bra under her shirt, tossing it into the Freedom Trash Can. This single act made national headlines and became a symbol for the entire feminist movement. However, nothing thrown in the metal bin was actually lit on fire. There were many similar protests around the nation following this, and amongst all these protests, there is a single report of bras being burnt, despite it being remembered as the defining characteristic of the movement. The War of the Stray Dog. The incident at Petrich was a small military incursion between Greece and Bulgaria in October 1925. Tensions had been escalating between the two nations throughout the beginning of the 20th century due to disputes over Macedonia and Western Thrace. They had engaged in open conflict multiple times, with Greece emerging victorious, but this was supposed to be a time of peace. Unfortunately, a Greek soldier's dog got away from him, crossing the border into Bulgaria. He chased after the dog, and Bulgarian border sentries opened fire on the Greek soldier, killing him. This resulted in a 10-day conflict, with Greece invading Bulgaria and killing 50 people, mostly civilians, before the League of Nations intervened and made them put an end to the fighting. The story of the conflict's origin is why it is sometimes referred to as the War of the Stray Dog. An alternate story suggests that Bulgarian forces crossed the border and attacked a Greek outpost. Since neither side was going to be eager to claim fault for the fighting breaking out, we will likely never know whether or not the war was really started by a dog. Hugo Boss designed the Nazi uniforms. Born in 1885, Hugo Boss was a German businessman who founded the luxury fashion house Hugo Boss AG. He was also a supporter of the Nazi Party, having joined in 1931 before Hitler even came to power. As such, there is a persistent rumor in modern times that Hugo Boss designed the Nazis' uniforms. While this isn't accurate, it is a simple misunderstanding rather than an outright fabrication. The iconic Schutzstaffel uniform was manufactured by Boss, but it was designed by German graphic designer Walter Heck, who was unaffiliated with Boss's company. Boss was manufacturing Nazi uniforms even before joining the Nazi Party, but afterwards he became a big supplier, manufacturing uniforms for both the SS and the Hitler Youth. Not only did Boss benefit by obtaining these manufacturing contracts, he was also given access to slave labor along the way, providing further financial benefits. So, while Hugo Boss was an active supporter of the Nazi Party who manufactured uniforms for them, he didn't actually design them. If the luxury fashion designer had been responsible for designing the SS's uniforms, their hats probably wouldn't have been decorated with a skull and crossbones.